has sun, sand, and it isn't far from the U.S., but for nearly 50 years, the island of Cuba has been off limits to American tourists. That could change, though. A group of 20 senators, Democrats and Republican alike, are now calling to reverse the travel ban. Joining us now, Ambassador Otto Reich, former Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs and former U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela, and Dan Erickson, author of The Cuba Wars and Senior Associate at Inter-American Dialogue. Ambassador Reich, let's begin with you. You're not in favor of dropping the tourism travel ban to Cuba. Why?
Well, I don't think we should treat a dictatorship as we treat a friendly country. We're not talking here about having people go to Jamaica for a holiday, number one. Number two, tourists have never liberated any country. Cuba has had a 50-year dictatorship, and what Castro wants more than anything is access to U.S. dollars. I don't think we should grant him those dollars unless he liberates, for example, the people who have been in prison, languishing and being tortured, or in some cases having been executed because they want the same freedoms that we enjoy.
But you could argue many of the same things about the Chinese government, and they hosted the Olympics this past summer. I mean, tourists were flocking there.
Yeah, and I don't think that most Americans would like to live under the conditions that the average Chinese lives under. They have had an opening on the economic side, but they have a huge gulag, prison camp archipelago where, you know, it is even alleged that people are executed for their body organs.
Yeah. Dan, what about it? I mean, there are allegations that the Cuban travel industry is essentially run by, you know, government bureaucrats and communist loyalists. And if you send a bunch of tourists down there, you're just enriching some of these people who torture their own folks.
Well, I really think you need to look at the Cuba issue in the broader context. The fact is, Cuba is the only country in the world where the United States bans its citizens from traveling there. And really today we're still very much stuck in a Cold War with Cuba, despite the fact that the Cold War ended in 1991. So I think that these senators who are proposing to lift the travel ban are exactly right. In the year 2009, it's time to move into a more modern era in our relations with Cuba, and I think open up engagement between the U.S. and Cuba.
Cuba is open to tourists from Canada and Europe and so forth. I mean, the country is still impoverished despite that. What good is American tourism going to help, Dan?
Well, I think that I actually concur with Ambassador Reich. It's not that tourism is going to democratize Cuba or somehow turn it into a Jeffersonian democracy. The issue is that it's going to be very difficult for the United States to argue to Cuba that you need to become a more democratic, open country, and we're going to achieve this by restricting the rights of American citizens to trade with Cuba, to travel with Cuba, and so forth. I think that really excessive U.S. governmental regulation of U.S. citizen travel to Cuba is not going to be the solution to democratizing Cuba, and that opening up to Cuba could actually set in motion a wider range of political processes that could lead to democratic reform.
Ambassador Reich, does the departure of Fidel Castro from the scene and handing over power to his younger brother, does that make any difference?
Well, he hasn't departed. And in fact, the recent changes in the government of Cuba indicate very clearly a tightening of the rule by the Castro brothers. Fidel Castro still runs the country from his hospital room. Raul Castro has just removed everybody that had any inkling of reforming the Cuban government from power. And in fact, the old line, the hardline Marxists are in complete control. But I also would like to add that, you know, what Dan says, that the Cold War ended in 1991, it ended for most of the world, but it didn't end for the people of Cuba. This is a Stalinist government that doesn't allow the people of their own country one single freedom, not a free press, not a free labor union. And by the way, the United States is the single largest provider of food to Cuba, so trade is not restricted with Cuba. We're the single largest exporter of food to Cuba in the entire world.
Ambassador,
we do have, and we also have trade, but I mean, we have travel.
Yeah, we will continue to watch this issue. Ambassador Otto Reich, Dan Erickson, thank you both.